We all ready to go, Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to check in with you all. NRC
Okay.
staff, are you guys ready to get started? George, you're kicking us off?
Yep, I am. Let me start the recording and then we'll get started.
Sounds good.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our second public webinar on the integrated low-level radioactive waste disposal rulemaking. My name is George Tartle. I'm a senior project manager in the materials rulemaking and project management branch in the NRC's Office of Nuclear Materials Safety and Safeguards, and I'm the project manager for this rulemaking. I'd like to acknowledge our facilitator for this public meeting is Sarah Lopez, who facilitated the first webinar for us, and you'll be hearing from her during the course of the meeting. Slide 2, please. The purpose of this public meeting is for the NRC staff to describe the draft regulatory concepts being addressed in this rulemaking, similar to how we did in the first webinar, but this time it will be more condensed. And that's because we want to reserve the majority of the time for this meeting for members of the public to make presentations. You heard a lot from the NRC staff in the first webinar, and this time we want to focus on hearing from you. After each presentation, we'll have a few minutes for questions and dialogue. However, the NRC staff will not be able to respond individually to all of the points made in each presentation. The NRC will consider all the points raised in the meeting and will incorporate changes to address the issues raised as appropriate. I'll also note that similar to the first webinar, we're not collecting formal public comments during this meeting. Rather, that will happen at a later point in the rulemaking process, and towards the end of the presentation, I'll mention when and how that will happen. Slide 3, please. So this is our agenda for the public meeting. I'll start with some meeting logistics, then we'll have some opening remarks by NRC management. Then we'll do a quick overview of the rulemaking and the technical topics being addressed, including safety case and technical assessments, timeframes and compliance period, GTCC criticality and physical protection, waste acceptance and exception criteria. After the NRC staff's presentation, we'll invite each of the public presenters to speak. After each of those presentations, we'll stop for questions and dialogue with the staff. If time permits, we'll invite other members of the public who wish to speak on this topic. Then I'll go over next steps for the rulemaking before we conclude the meeting. We're going to try to make it through the meeting in one shot without a break, so let's see how that goes. Slide 4, please. So I have a few logistical items to go over to help the meeting go more smoothly. Please note that we are recording this meeting. If you do not consent to being recorded, you may disconnect at this time. Because we are recording the meeting, we ask that only one person speak at a time. Please identify yourself and your organization when you start speaking, and please speak clearly. All attendees have the ability to mute and unmute your microphones. To reduce unnecessary background noise, please stay on mute when you're not speaking. If you have a question, raise your hand if you would like to speak, and then we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. To raise your hand, you can click the hand icon in Microsoft Teams. You should see that near the top of the window. If you're joining us today by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *5. When we call on you, you can unmute by clicking on the microphone button in Microsoft Teams. If you're joining us by phone, you can unmute by pressing *6. You may also need to unmute your handset if you press the mute button there. So for phone participants only, again, that's *5 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. And you can remember which one is which because a hand has 5 fingers. We won't be able to see the names for those who are on the phone, so we'll just identify you by the last 4 digits of your number. The chat feature is enabled in today's meeting. Please use it for asking questions if you prefer to do so rather than speak your question, or to let us know something isn't working properly during the meeting. Everything in this meeting will be done verbally, so it's captured in the recording. Again, just raise your hand if you want to speak. The presentation slides will be shown via Microsoft Teams. If you connected using the link in the meeting notice, you should see the slides now. You can also access the slides in our Atom system at accession number ML24022A141. Links to the slides have also been posted to the meeting notice on the NRC's public website, including those of the NRC and the public presenters. The Atom's accession numbers for each of the slides will also be referenced in the meeting summary that we will issue next month. We'll try to call out each slide number as we advance the slides so attendees can follow along. And one more quick note for those of you who are on the phone, to include you on the list of attendees, please send an email to the meeting contact, me, George Tartle. My email address is, as you see it here on the slide, george.tartal@nrc.gov. And slide 5, please. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Jane Marshall, who's going to make some opening remarks. Jane, please.
Thank you, George. Hi, I'm Jane Marshall. I'm the Director for the Division of Decommissioning, Uranium Recovery, and Waste Programs in the Office of Nuclear Materials Safety and Safeguards. First of all, I'd like to thank each of you for attending this second public webinar on the integrated low-level radioactive waste disposal rulemaking. As many of you know, this integrated rulemaking combines two ongoing efforts, and you may have been involved in commenting on those previously. Those are the Part 61 rulemaking related to large quantities of depleted uranium and the greater than Class C regulatory basis. Now that the Commission has given the staff the direction to develop the licensing criteria to allow for near surface disposal of GTCC waste and to allow for agreement states to regulate GTCC. We believe this rulemaking will increase the disposal options for currently stored GTCC waste, develop consistent criteria for performing site-specific analyses of all low-level waste streams disposed at each disposal facility, and allow for agreement states to incorporate these regulations into their existing programs with compatibility and flexibility. We believe, when finalized, this rulemaking will provide many tangible benefits to industry and to the public. A heavier reliance on site-specific technical analysis will allow for the proper evaluation of wastes that were not anticipated when 10 CFR Part 61 was originally developed, or even waste that may not be envisioned today, such as those that may be generated by advanced reactor concepts. The use of a safety case will better align the U.S. requirements with international standards and provide a platform for licensees to clearly describe the technical basis for the performance of the disposal facility. The public should have better transparency of complex information in the regulatory decision-making process. We held the first meeting on this topic in May of last year when staff presented the preliminary direction and regulatory concepts for the rulemaking. We received positive feedback on that meeting and on the staff's responsiveness to the many questions that were asked by stakeholders. Staff have carefully considered the stakeholder feedback in developing the current proposed rule package. Recently, we heard from several stakeholders that they would like to have another public meeting where stakeholders can provide additional feedback to NRC staff in their own presentations and dialogue. Typically, holding public meetings such as the one in May and this one today are not the standard rulemaking process. The NRC staff typically submits a proposed rule package to the Commission, who then vote and sometimes direct changes to the package. After all Commission changes are directed, then the proposed rule is issued for comment. Our rulemaking process is structured in a way that the public can make comments on proposed rules, and those comments, if warranted, may result in changes to the final rule. However, due to stakeholder requests, the NRC is making an exception to the standard rulemaking process and having this public meeting before the proposed rule is issued for comment. For this meeting, staff requested stakeholders to contact them if they desired to make a presentation. We received 5 requests to make presentations. Before those, staff will first provide a brief overview of the rulemaking history and the proposed changes for the rulemaking. Then the meeting will include time reserved for the presenters who have asked to speak and for others who would like to ask questions. After each presentation, we'll pause for questions and a dialogue between the presenters, NRC staff, and members of the public. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Dave Esch, who is one of the technical leads on this rulemaking. Dave?
Thanks, Jane. Hope everybody's having a good day. Unfortunately, you're not going to have to listen to me for 2 hours, but that's also unfortunate that we're going to try to cover so much ground in a short amount of time. So we had the comment that the slides weren't moving. Now the slides are really going to move because this meeting is about trying to get input from some of the stakeholders that wanted to share some of their views. So our integrated low-level waste rulemaking has been ongoing for not that long now, but it is a spin-off from a previous activity where we were developing requirements in the what was called the unique waste streams rulemaking 10 CFR Part 61. So what happened is basically that rulemaking was going at a somewhat glacial pace with lots of starts and restarts. And we had a separate activity to look at the disposal of GTCC waste because the original regulation, what's on the books right now, prohibits the disposal of GTCC waste without special case-by-case considerations. And so the state of Texas came in and asked us, hey, can an agreement state regulate the disposal of GTCC waste? And so that kicked off a second activity. It caught up with the first activity, and there's an awful lot of overlap between the two. And so therefore it became this integrated rulemaking, this consolidated one. And for those of you that are taking part in this meeting and haven't participated in the previous meetings, I'm very sympathetic to you. We're going to go pretty quick here. And so if we cover things that we don't talk to points that are on the slides, feel free to reach out to us in the question and answer parts of the meeting or after the meeting. You'll have contact information for people. Okay, so this integrated low-level waste rulemaking is trying to achieve a number of things. We're trying to consolidate and integrate the GTCC activity with the previous 10 CFR Part 61 unique waste streams rulemaking. We're looking at conducting site-specific analyses for these different waste streams. We believe this is a more risk-informed approach, and it will allow the very different disposal facilities and waste streams to be properly evaluated and their safety ensured for disposal. A few key elements to that are one, this graded approach to the compliance period, which had an awful lot of attention in the previous activity, the 10 CFR Part 61 rulemaking. We're also including transuranic waste in the definition of low-level waste, which that was more of a bookkeeping issue rather than a technical issue. We can talk about that if necessary. And then there are some different concerns that came up, especially with respect to GTCC waste, addressing physical protection and criticality. And then finally, this rulemaking will provide for agreement state licensing of certain GTCC waste streams. So slide 7, please. So slide 7 here is the safety case and technical assessments. The safety case is widely recognized internationally, and we believe and assert that our original Part 61 has many elements of the safety case. We believe this is a useful tool for stakeholders to better understand decisions and the basis for the decisions. One weakness, not just in the US, but I'd say somewhat in some programs internationally too, is the transparency of the information on which these decisions are based. So from both the operator side, or what we call licensees in the US, to the regulator side, or the regulator's review of the technical information, and then their determination whether it meets requirements or not. All of that could be more transparent with stakeholders. And I think based on all the effort that goes into doing these evaluations and ensuring that they're appropriate, people should not be shy about sharing that information with stakeholders and allowing them to have a look at it. A key element of our revisions is our changes to the technical analyses, but I do want to make sure it's clear that this whole approach, Part 61 and all its elements, it's very much not just about technical analyses. Yes, that is a key piece, but there are many other very important pieces that all fit together in a nice safety puzzle, if you want to put it that way. The technical analyses I'm going to go over, so I'm not going to talk about the 5 ticks here because I have a slide on each one. We'll go over those quickly. Next slide, please. Slide 8. So safety case, a high-level summary of the information. That's what we're looking for because we do believe the safety case is pretty much already present in Part 61. That's terminology that developed over the last few decades. So it wasn't terminology that was really typically used when Part 61 was developed in the early 1980s. But we want people to think about executive summary. So if you can explain in 5 or 10 pages what you're doing, why it's safe, why it's an appropriate action. That's what we're envisioning is the new added piece to the safety case, in addition to all the other pieces that were pre-existing. The technical analyses, all the management controls, the monitoring, site selection, all those sorts of institutional controls, all those things that help you achieve your safety objectives. Those all fit together in a nice safety puzzle. This safety case provides reasonable assurance that the disposal site will be capable of isolating waste and limiting releases. It helps describe the strength and reliability of the technical analyses. And there's various considerations that we feel are the pieces of the safety case, and they're listed on the slide here. Next slide, please, slide 9. Performance assessment is the first area of those bulleted technical analyses. It's new terminology, so performance assessment new in terms of like maybe the late 1990s or mid 1990s is when the terminology kind of first started being used in the US. So in 1982 or the early 1980s, it was just referred to as technical analyses. And now we use the terminology performance assessment. It's evolved over time, a lot of understanding. The capabilities are enormously stronger than what they were in the early 1980s. Just think about what your, Android or iPhone can do compared to what computer tools you may have used in the 1980s. I mean, I thought my Atari 2600 was pretty fancy, but if you play one of those today and you played one of those like I did, you realize how much technology has advanced. There is significant guidance that we developed to support the performance assessment. That's going to be a new Reg 2175. I encourage all of you to take a look at that document. It's quite long, but it's quite detailed, and we think it's a good improvement from what we had previously. And we have new Reg 1573, which was kind of the first stab at some guidance on performance assessment. So this new Reg 2175 supplements that previous guidance that was developed in the late 1990s by a group of really smart people. Next slide, please. So the one area that we absolutely have to change in this rulemaking, if nothing else was done, is in this area of the intruder assessment. And the reason why that is because our tables in 10 CFR Part 61 under 6155, they were developed based on NRC analysis, so the regulator analyzing what wastes we thought would be disposed and how they would be disposed. So the result of that are tables of concentrations of key isotopes. Those are found in Table 1 and Table 2, okay? Those two tables are derived by the regulatory analysis, and they're fixed by the assumptions that were made when the NRC did the analysis in the early 1980s. So they're based off a humid site, shallowly disposed of waste, and potential intrusion or interaction with the disposed waste by a member of the public starting after an active institutional control period that would prevent people from being on the site and accessing the waste for 100 years. Okay. So what we're doing in this rulemaking is we're basically changing that to the licensee or operator will do their site-specific intruder analysis, essentially the same sort of analysis that we would do or did do in the early 1980s, but it will allow them to reflect how the waste is disposed, how it's packaged, what form it's in, what waste forms are used, how deep it is, the environmental conditions at the site. It's just basically allowing the actual site to be analyzed instead of a generic site that the regulator analyzed. So next slide, please, slide 11. Site stability assessment. This is a technical analysis that would be required for 6144. It's not expected as a different or new analyses for existing sites or for those sites that are disposing of waste that do not contain significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides. For those sites, it's all about the things that were observed in the early, I don't know, anywhere 60s through 80s, where there were stability problems at the sites, especially with respect to surface water management. And those stability problems resulted in differential settlement, ponding, water getting into trenches, all sorts of performance challenges. For the most part, I think those performance challenges have been solved associated with the stability of the site when it's first developed. But when you move to potentially disposing of large quantities or significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides, then you have to start worrying about not just the disposal facility itself, but how stable is the land around the disposal facility. So how stable is the site and surrounding environment? Because erosion or changes to that site environment over the long term could impact the stability of the waste that is disposed. Next slide, please. Slide 12. Other direction. There we go. Operational safety assessment. This is the analyses that may be done for 6143. What's done right now in the U.S. is operational safety is determined or established by management controls and all sorts of features like procedures, radiation monitoring, training, those variety of management controls and procedures ensure the safety of the operational facilities. And it's a testament to the operators in the U.S. and their regulators in the U.S. that we have 4 operating facilities, and they've mostly been operating for, I guess, a total of maybe 140 operational years, with very, very little impacts to the public or the surrounding environment. So those have been operated very safely. So it shows that this part of the regulation is working very well. There's no need to change it. For GTCC waste, however, some of it may have very high concentrations of certain radionuclides. And when you move into higher concentrations of certain radionuclides, then you have to worry about operational accidents such as fires or container drops, because it doesn't take a lot of plutonium, for instance, when released to create an environmental impact. So that just means that as you move up the risk ladder with the types of radioactivity and especially the concentrations of certain radionuclides, that you move into a space that's more a traditional operational safety assessment. This is done for all sorts of operating nuclear facilities. It's nothing new. So fuel cycle facilities, reactors, et cetera, they do these sorts of evaluations for potential offsite impacts in the event of an accident. Next slide, please. The performance period analyses is something I'm going to skip over a little bit here because we're going to talk about timeframes in a couple slides, but it's basically the way we've structured our timeframes for the analysis is we for a site that contains significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides, then the performance period, the compliance period, will be 10,000 years, followed by a performance period analysis. So what's described on this slide here is what you would do after 10,000 years if you have significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides. If you do not have significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides, then you would use a 1,000-year compliance period, and you don't do anything, you don't do any performance period analyses. 1,000 years is sufficient because you don't have sufficient long-lived radioactivity to cause long-term impacts. Next slide, please. Okay, so safety and compliance, there's safety can be achieved through different means. As Jane indicated, and I've described here, we're leaning more heavily on technical analyses because we think that's the right way to go from being risk informed, and it affords greater flexibility for engineers to be smart engineers. And I think all of us would agree that we should encourage more engineering and smart engineering. But if the technical analyses is viewed as being too uncertain or not palatable, there are other ways that you can achieve safety, and that is done in some programs throughout the world. So you can specify a disposal concept, for instance. What's in Part 61 right now for GTCC waste, which basically reads, the GTCC waste should be geologically disposed unless you make, an argument on a case-by-case basis. So that's the disposal concept. You could achieve safety through prescriptive design. So for instance, the reason we started off that original Part 61 rulemaking was for large quantities of depleted uranium. Well, one of the impacts from disposal of large quantities of depleted uranium is radon. One way to mitigate radon is to put the waste deeper. So you could have prescriptive depth disposal requirements for the large quantities of radon and the long time when the daughters decay and the radon builds in. You would need something like 10 to 15 meters if you were going to go by a prescriptive design approach in order to ensure overall moisture conditions that you could achieve your performance objectives. We think it's smarter and more appropriate to rely on the technical analyses combined with some of these other things. So you'll see that in our regulatory language. So it's a kind of all these things fit together with, if it's a three-legged stool, the technical analysis leg of the stool is much thicker. Next slide, please. Other direction. Yeah. Timeframes, compliance period, I talked about this a bit. What we're proposing, or pre-proposing, I guess is what I should say, is to use different compliance periods depending on the long-lived component of the waste. We think this is flexible and site-specific. It was mentioned by the commission to us and the direction they gave us. The compliance period would be 1,000 years without significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides, otherwise 10,000 in the performance period. The primary consideration for us is the current practices in agreement states, which vary. There's something called a compatibility class, which will likely allow the agreement states to be more restrictive. So that means that, for instance, in Texas, their requirements are 1,000 years or peak dose, whichever is longer. That would be consistent with what we're proposing here. Utah had some proposed regulations on the book. I don't know if they were finalized, but they would be consistent with what we have here also, just as some examples. We did a lot of work to consider what was done in the US and other programs, and especially internationally. And we believe that we're fully consistent to the extent that we can be with this. Most programs internationally for near surface disposal, because remember, radioactive waste does not have to go in the near surface. There are other alternatives. They tend to be more expensive and more difficult to implement, but it's not just the one-trick pony for where you're going to put your waste. And when you look at other programs, that's exactly what they do. So for near surface disposal, what is typically done, the majority of programs, they'll set strict limits for the concentrations of radionuclides that can be disposed in the near surface. Then, in addition to that, they will analyze for a very long time, many cases to see when the peak is and how big the peak impacts are. And they also, in addition to that, have not to any real extent disposed of large quantities of depleted uranium or concentrated low-level waste, which we call GTCC in the US, and internationally they call it intermediate level waste. There's not been a lot of programs that have progressed to disposing of that type of waste. So that's kind of the context of where we are with the timeframes. I know we'll have some discussion on that. Next slide, please. Now for GTCC waste, because of the radionuclides that are present, there are some additional concerns that usually do not occur for quote unquote normal low-level waste. That can occur, or that is criticality and additional criticality protection. It has occurred in some cases for low-level waste disposal. We've done reviews for some disposals in the agreement state facilities to evaluate potential criticality and ensure that the proper regulatory limits and constraints were put in place, or license conditions were put in place to ensure that criticality would not occur. So criticality is a kind of a new piece that comes up specifically with GTCC waste because of its composition. Next slide, please. There's also a consideration for physical protection for the same reason that I talked about with respect to criticality, that because of the radionuclides present, their quantities and concentrations, then some other restrictions and controls kick in. We're trying to be smart about how this is done for GTCC waste physical protection. We are accounting for the fact that the very dilute waste is not going to be mechanically separable and therefore has limited attractiveness. So it would be a very challenging engineering and other problem for somebody to take low-level waste and extract out the radionuclides that they might be after. We feel what we're doing here for physical protection is consistent with the IAEA and approaches by the DOE. Next slide, please. Waste acceptance is something that we're revising under 6158. We have site-specific waste acceptance criteria. It has the three main components shown on the left. We are modeling what we're doing here after DOE. We think DOE does this very well. That basically you can use the 6155 limits that are provided in Table 1 or Table 2 to classify your waste and then accept it at the disposal facility, or you can use the results of your 6113 technical analysis to accept waste at your disposal facility. But when you do that, you have to ensure that there's proper characterization, proper criteria are applied, and that certification is done that the waste that is going to be disposed meets the waste acceptance criteria. Licensees will be required to review their waste acceptance program annually, and the waste acceptance criteria, if approved, get incorporated into the license. So generators will still use 6155 for waste classification. We do have a task on the books that the commission gave us to look at the waste classification system and potentially revise it. So that is a much bigger lift than this one. So even this one that has been so complicated and time consuming, revising the waste classification system, I would envision would easily take me to the end of my career, unfortunately. So, but it is on the books, and it would be something that would be smart to do. It would be fairly complicated. So just to keep an eye on that piece that's hanging out there. Next slide, please. So exception criteria, this was something that was directed to us by the commission. Basically, they said, okay, we want you to take a similar approach to what was done when Part 61 was initially implemented. Because remember, prior to Part 61, the disposal of radioactive waste didn't have criteria that were applied to establish what was done. And so those historical operating facilities, they said, okay, this is going to be real difficult for us for a step change in the regulatory regime. And so the NRC said, okay, we'll be practical and pragmatic about this. We'll allow for the existing facilities to either not apply or take time to implement the criteria that were implemented. And a similar approach was asked for here. So if there is burden associated with the new regulatory requirements, if an existing facility has been operating safely and accepting waste appropriately for 3 decades, why should they change their requirements and do it differently, especially for facilities that might not have a lot of capacity left and might be approaching the end of their facility life? That seemed a very reasonable and pragmatic approach. So the way it's written right now is the land disposal facility, if the license was originally issued before the effective date of this rule, and they're not accepting any of these more complicated or long-term challenging waste streams, then they can just continue to use the regulatory criteria and approach that they previously used. Otherwise, they would need to update it and use the things that I talked about in the brief. I don't know how many minutes I've been rambling now. So the accepted licensees would be required to comply with the original Part 61 regulations for the sections noted above, 6113, 4142, and 58. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I think I'll hand it back over to George, and he'll talk about who's going to talk, and we'll go from there. Thanks, George.
Yeah, so Dave, before we get to the public presenters, we're going to open up the meeting to others who would like to ask questions or get maybe Dave to clarify a point or two of his. I do see in the chat that we have one member of the public who's asking a whole lot of questions. But at this point, I'll turn it back over to Sarah, since you're the facilitator, and you go ahead and run this part however you'd like. Thanks.
Okay. Well, so first, I want to ask if anybody has any questions on the staff's approach, specifically what Dave just covered. We do see some of the questions in the chat from Tim Ganaway that may be a little out of scope at the moment, but Dave, I know you want to kind of maybe have some moments to digest, because all these questions came in while you were talking. So I'll give you a moment to read through. And so we're going to start. I do see Wyatt raising his hand. I do want to just remind everybody that you can hit the raise hand button to ask a question, and I'll call on you in just a moment. So if you're here on Teams, you'll be raising your hand. And if you're on the phone, you'll be pressing *5. So Wyatt, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Just remember to introduce yourself and go ahead and you can start us off.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. My name is Wyatt Padgett. I'm the head of compliance for Urenco USA. So I was hoping to see a discussion on revised regulatory analysis, even if it's only draft. Will anything be shared before the rule goes to the commission, or is the basis from the previous rulemaking efforts still being used?
I can state that the regulatory analysis was revised, or has been revised for this new rulemaking. I'll let George or Aaron Sanders reply as to the availability of that to the public and when it might be available.
Yeah, so in terms of availability to the public, I don't think you're going to see anything be released before it goes to the commission. However, I will second what Dave said, that we've significantly revised the regulatory analysis from the previous version that you've seen. So you will see a lot of changes when you see the regulatory analysis that supports our rulemaking.
That I just had.
Okay, thank you. Can I follow up on that? So in the previous regulatory analysis, the commission required additional information to be provided, and after they did so, nothing was published responding to that direction. Is that something that's being considered in the new analysis that's being presented to the commission?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the Federal Register notice that the NRC staff sent out asking for comments on that version of the regulatory analysis. And yes, we've taken a look at all of the comments that we got on that version of the regulatory analysis. But again, this is going to be a very different looking regulatory analysis that you're going to see that supports the integrated rule.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. One last question on this note. So working on a new regulatory analysis, maybe not complete at the moment. Is it expected that when it comes to some certain aspects of that analysis that the industry will be engaged or at least in impacted individuals? And I'm thinking specifically when it comes to the cost benefit aspect of the analysis.
So I'm not sure I exactly know how to answer your question other than during the public comment period, you will have access to the regulatory analysis and provide whatever comments you like on the regulatory analysis at that point.
Yeah, one thing I would tell you, Wyatt, is that you know, our processes, we're pre-proposed right now, and so that creates some challenges because everybody's anxious to see things and know what's going on and what we're going to say. But it will hopefully get to proposed, and then you get all the information, and I think you'll have plenty of time to look at it and give detailed comments on it. And I also would like to point out that if there is apprehension about, well, if we don't comment now before it becomes proposed, then it gets fixed. That's not the case at all. You can just look at the existing Part 61 and the difference between the proposed for that and the final for that. And there were significant changes based on stakeholder comments between the proposed and the final. So that does happen, you know, if there's value and warrant in the comments and justification for changing something, it will happen in the rulemaking process.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Wyatt. So we got 3 more people that have their hands raised. So I'm going to move on for time's sake. Karen Haddon, you may go ahead and unmute yourself. Karen, are you there? And you will just have to click on your microphone icon to unmute yourself. Karen Haddon. There we go. I can hear you.
Hi, I just want to raise some concerns that these ever hotter materials going into low-level waste dumps has, for the public and for public safety and health, when I hear criticality, that is of huge concern. And that's especially of concern in Texas, where we've got a RCRA site right next to the low-level waste site. I mean, literally adjacent. And that has explosive, corrosive chemicals of many kinds all buried there. So I just want to express deep concern and opposition to what is being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Next, we have Mike Woodward. Mike, you can unmute yourself by hitting the microphone icon.
Thank you. Mike Woodward, I'm with the law firm Hance Scarborough. And the term significant quantities of long-lived radionuclides came up in several slides. And I'm just wondering, from a layperson, is there going to be a easy way to determine what a significant quantity is?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. So the way that we've tried to tackle that problem is it's not a simple, you know, A times B times C type of answer to that question, because the sites can be considerably different, and the waste can be considerably different. And so what's significant at you know, in Texas might be different than the value or the concentration that would be significant in Utah, for instance, or Washington or South Carolina. So we did write an appendix to that guidance document that I mentioned, New Reg 2175, that allows somebody to step through how to determine if they would have a significant quantity or not. And we recommend that people start simple. So there are some screening values in there that would be pretty restrictive. You could compare against those. So if you generate material that has very low concentrations of long-lived radionuclides, then you just compare to the screening values, and that would get you a quick answer. But many times that for these types of problems, the quick answer may not be appropriate. So you have to sharpen your pencil a bit, bring out your more complicated computer, you know, from your Atari to your 286, at least, and maybe do a bit more complicated technical evaluation of what's significant. That's outlined in the appendix. I believe it's appendix H of draft new reg 2175, and we would certainly invite stakeholder comment on that.
Okay, and next I see Connie Klein has their hand raised. Connie, you may unmute yourself by hitting the microphone icon.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to read you a short quote. This is an NRC quote. There is no way to guarantee that any disposal facility for any waste will not release some amount of radioactivity. No structure or site can be guaranteed to contain radioactive waste in perpetuity. Given the fact that facilities deteriorate and human institutions may not maintain complete control, NRC chose to rely on the more realistic requirements of 100 years of institutional care. That's from an old low-level radioactive waste NRC document. I have the accession number if you're interested. Does that concept still theoretically apply?
Yeah, I'd say I agree with what you read. So there's two pieces there. One is the active control, the institutional control period of when you would have somebody maintaining fences and preventing anybody from doing anything on the site. That period is the technical analysis is allowed to be up to 100 years, though somebody could implement active controls longer than that. At the time that the active control and that whole concept was put in place, it was around Love Canal and some other events like that, where people had unknowingly been exposed to chemicals. It wasn't really radioactive waste, but chemical waste of various types. And so the belief was that there would be some likelihood of government or other error as you go out in time with control of and maintenance of these facilities. Just loss of knowledge, essentially. Knowledge management is a hard thing, especially over long time frames. And that's really what they're talking about. But then once you put radioactive waste in place, or municipal waste in your neighborhood landfill, or chemical waste in a RCRA facility, none of those facilities are going to contain that material indefinitely. There will be some small amounts that get out of those facilities over time. And our regulations are about ensuring that what does get out and why is limited to low amounts, that it doesn't pose a safety concern. So conceptually, yes, that long answer, I agree completely with what you read.
I didn't write it, the NRC wrote that, but
no, I said what you read.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
I have one other question. This may be a stupid question, although I don't think any questions are stupid. Is any of this being proposed for on-site at reactor low-level radioactive waste containment?
No, this is for removal of material to a disposal facility.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Okay. In the interest of time, I know we had some other hands raised and we've got a bunch of questions in the chat. We do have to move on because we have 5 additional presentations that we need to get into. So Dan,
do you want me to, I mean, I think we should be fair to Tim. He has a whole bunch of questions here. Could I at least maybe commit to like emailing him some responses to him or something like that?
I was going to suggest that would be extra helpful. So Tim, if you don't mind, you can, I can put George Tartle's email or Dave's email in the chat, and that way you can email one of those to your laundry list of questions. And
Yeah, just
I'm
make
gonna,
sure they don't go poof somehow, that we get them. And then
Oh,
you know,
we
I
will-
think we,
but, yep.
we owe it to him to give him some responses. He took the time to ask those questions. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to pull open right now Daniel Schrumm's presentation. So George, I'll hand it over to you to hand it over to Mr. Schrumm.
Well, I think you already did that, Sarah. So Daniel, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can begin your presentation as soon as Sarah's screen shows the presentation.
Just confirming that you can hear me.
Yeah,
we can.
Okay.
Yep.
If you could bring up the first title. Thank you for the opportunity to present. Been looking forward to this for quite a while. If you go to the next slide, I'm one of those people that have been tracking this for quite a while. I think the first meeting I went to was in 2008 when we first started talking about, at the time it was the depleted uranium rule. And I was excited when this SRM came out. I would have to say that I had to take all my information off of the shelf, dust it off, and you know, some of the things have changed since we last discussed this. But you know, sometimes your cheese gets moved and you move with it, or you go find new cheese. So I'm ready to move forward. So next slide. My presentation will generally discuss the following: GTCC, the compliance period, the intruder analysis, the exception clause, and was already mentioned that the regulatory analysis was not enough. Next slide, please. The low-level forum, like the NRC, believes that disposal is always preferable to storage. And so with whatever I say with respect to anything with this integrated rulemaking, understand that we believe that disposal is preferable to storage. That's the backbone of this entire of the rule, and that disposal is important. So if you could go to the next slide. With respect to GTCC, this is a slide from the NRC, and it talks about how the DOE was assigned responsibility for GTC's disposal, and the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Amendment Act, the Policy Act, did not address agreement state regulation of the disposal of GTCC waste. It also talks about in Section 274 that the Atomic Energy Act talks about agreement state licensing for disposal of byproduct material. It also states that to promote an orderly regulatory pattern between the Commission and state governments with respect to nuclear development and use and regulation of byproduct source and special nuclear material. So next slide, please. So this is where GTC is kind of mentioned in Part 61. I have found that GTCC is specifically mentioned in the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act, but it's not specifically mentioned in the rule as in the term GTCC, but this is what we're talking about, and that's things that are greater than Class C, and there might be additional requirements needed for disposal. Next slide, please. So my questions with respect to GTCC and the importance of now this may become a state responsibility, and if it's a state responsibility and if it's going to fall completely in the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act, will all agreement states assume regulatory authority over GTCC? And I know that you're going to be doing a general rule, and that I understand, and there may not be the specifics, but there's going to be some potential for dual licensing at some of the facilities, and who will have, you know, for example, an ISFC contains spent fuel, it also contains GTCC. Will there be a need to have, will the states need to license the ISFC also for disposal or for storage of GTCC, those kind of things. The second part is, will compacts have authority over the movement of GTCC consistent with the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act? And will compacts have authority over the disposal of commercial GTCC if waste is going to an agreement state licensed facility? So again, very supportive of moving forward with the rule, but these are some questions that we have and I don't know if we'll be able to get them answered. But hopefully the rule will take care of it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I thought I knew until I started attending the recent meetings is that I was assuming that we were going to have a compliance period of 1,000. And it looks like Dave is proposing at this time a 10,000 year for the longer lived isotopes. Okay. Next slide, please. And, you know, Dave, I'm not uneducated on this. I realize the problem, and, you know, is the right answer 1,000? Is the right answer 10,000? As we can see from the ingrowth with U-238, which is depleted uranium, things start to pick up at about 10,000 years. Things get more interesting later on, but then there's also the sensitivity of what does the analysis mean? Next slide, please. So you used some of the following slides, and my only point is that for low-level waste, it seems that the standard is 1,000 years. For intermediate waste or weir waste incidental to reprocessing, there's a 10,000-year time frame, and it doesn't seem to be there's a consistency with what the DOE is doing and what the NRC is proposing. And I understand you don't have to be consistent, but it would be nice. I'm also not clear with this slide and the next one. Is it a compliance period or is it a time evaluated? And is there a difference between compliance period and time evaluated? And are those combined? And what does that mean? So if we could go to the next slide. This just says, oops, a little too far. Just says time evaluated and assessment years, same number of dots. So anyway, go to the next slide. I don't know if 1,000 years is right or 10,000 years or a bajillion years is correct, but we do need to have some sort of a reasonable time frame. You did answer this question already. So the question is, will a compliance period and a performance period be required? It sounds like you're going to require a performance period. That sounds like it will be mandated. I'm not sure what those requirements will be during the performance period. So understand generally what it will be during the compliance period. What will a standard be for the performance period? My other comment on, as I've been watching this, I always thought that the PA performance assessment informed a licensing decision. In the last several years of trying to go through this, it appears that the PA is the licensing decision, and we're losing the importance of the siting criteria. The siting was really important to the facilities that have been licensed under Part 61. And let's realize, you know, a PA has its limits. They're good, they're wonderful. I support them, have been part of many of them. But there are some limits in a PA. And my goal isn't just for the existing 4, but the goal is to get another facility licensed. And to do that, we need to have a reasonable and flexible approach, and one that is not a barrier to entry for the next facility that may or may not be built. Okay, next slide, please. This is your slide. The technical analysis. So this talks about how we've improved our technology, where the computer skills are better, and all that thing. Go ahead and go to the next one. And that the basis still, or the old basis, was 6155, and the NRC had done an intruder assessment based off of a generic site. And the revised requirement would allow for a site-specific intruder assessment, and that's great. And you call this a flexible and risk-informed approach. I agree with you. That's perfect. Next slide, please. My question, and you know I've said this before, but is mandating a probability of 1. In other words, mandating that an intruder will come in contact with the waste, consistent with flexible and risk-informed approach, because to me, it takes away the site-specific intruder assessment that these facilities are built in remote areas where there's not a lot of things going on. So now you have stated in the past, the NRC stated in the past, that the probability of 1 is compensated a little bit by a 500 milligram per year compliance dose. And I don't think that's quite the same. So what I'm concerned about in the modeling, in the performance assessment, is a never-ending what-if group of scenarios, and we don't need that. I mean, it should always be challenged, but there has to be an end to these. Okay, next slide. I'll burn through this really fast. What once was called the grandfather clause, and I completely understand why we're not using the term grandfather clause. That's something that we came up with. That's what we called it. But in reality, it's not really mentioned. But this is what 61(1)A used to say. Next slide, please. This is how you originally had proposed to remove that old ability to, allow a facility to continue to operate. Next slide, please. And this is the exception criteria, which I don't really have a problem with, other than I don't like the term exception. It sounds like exemption, and these facilities should not be accepted or exempted. They're actually operating under the rules as we know them. So if we go to the next slide, I would propose that we just leave this in there, which was originally known as the grandfather clause, but it's that the applicability of the requirements in this part to commission licenses for waste disposal facilities in effect on the effective date of this rule, put the date in there, can be determined on a case-by-case basis. And those are for the facilities that want to continue to operate, but not take significant quantities of depleted uranium or GTCC waste. It's just a suggestion. I didn't see a problem with it the way before, and it worked before when we originally came up with Part 61. And the next slide is one that you already answered. It sounds like we'll have a more thorough regulatory analysis. And I went slightly over my 10 minutes, but just a little bit. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. NRC staff, I wanted to first kind of stop with you all to see if there are any clarifying questions on Dan's presentation.
Dan, this is Dave. Dan, you had I think a question for us on maybe, I don't know, slide 4 or something. If you go back a little bit, whoever's controlling these. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, go forward.
Okay.
I think it's this. Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh,
No,
here we go. Here.
There.
Is it
Yeah.
this one?
Yeah. So, no, the next one. Yeah, it wasn't next one.
It's not about GTCC.
No, no, it was one more. Okay, not that one. Oh yeah, the comment on this one here. You said you don't know what the requirements are for the performance period. They are in the draft rulemaking materials, the pre-proposed, I guess I'd call it. Basically, for the performance period, it's an ALARA-like criteria. So you're to demonstrate that you've reduced impacts to the extent practical, some sort of language like that. So, but I asked you to just look at that language. It is there, what the criteria would be for that performance period. And
okay,
the reason why we did that is twofold. One, we do acknowledge that at longer times there are additional sources of uncertainty that come into play, and that in the U.S. or throughout the world, the radiation protection limits that are applied strictly in some cases for very long times, but in other cases for a shorter period of time followed by other criteria, that there are differences of opinion as to what level of radiation protection is appropriate. And we do have the intruder protection or intruder assessment that would be required now. And that provides a natural limitation of what those long-term impacts from like groundwater and air pathways can be, because you can't meet the intruder criteria. All but under very rare or special circumstances could you potentially meet the intruder protection criteria and then result in very large impacts to a member of the public offsite. So that's how those pieces are meant to fit together. It's not that we're shortchanging anybody over the long term, but we're doing some criteria that work with the complexities of the problem and provide protection in a way that many other programs in the world also do that sort of thing. So it's not unique to the U.S.
And thank you for that response. Again, following along with the DOE, they have a compliance period, and then they do a qualitative analysis after that.
Mm-hmm.
Just for evaluation. It sounds like you will have another set of criteria, which is fine.
Yeah, it's criteria, but it's just like a LARA. So I mean, people, it's not a LARA exactly. There's a legal difference between a LARA and what we're presenting here. So we couldn't use the same language exactly, but conceptually, it's meant to be similar.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And on your and one more on your dot plot, Dan, or the comments about the dot plot. I don't know if I agree with you that the dot plot shows that the 1,000 years is used for most low-level waste analyses. If you look at U.S. and internationally, the red dots are the ones that you represent in the low-level waste forum. One of them is shorter than 1,000. 3 of them are longer than 1,000. And internationally, the vast majority of them are well beyond 1,000 years.
Yeah, but there's also different criteria, and we don't need to discuss it here. But I also know that that dot to the far left is not in the right place. But I'll send you an email about that.
Okay.
So thanks for that discussion. I want to remind everyone something I said towards the outset of the meeting, that we just won't have the time to get into a point-by-point discussion for all the points that are made in these presentations or all the questions that are being provided in these presentations. I will say once again that we will be doing a public meeting summary after this meeting, and so I'm going to do my best to summarize the points and questions that are being made during the public meeting. So we're going to have to defer some of that discussion to a later time. So let's get to another question, and then we'll move on to the next presenter, please.
Okay. So it looks like Stephen Sondheim has had their hand raised for a little while now. So Stephen, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And you do that by hitting the microphone icon just one time. Stephen Sondheim. Oh, all right. And Stephen's hand went down. Let me see here. Or no, it is still there. All right, Stephen, I'm going to give you one last chance to unmute yourself. And you just hit the microphone icon in Teams.
Am I unmuted?
Go. Yep, okay. Now you are. Great.
I sent in a chat, 2 of them, and one of them didn't go through. But anyway, I want a couple of questions here. In Memphis, about 10 years ago, the local administration and the public discovered that there was up-to-sea radioactive waste being dumped in our garbage dumps. And we were appalled. So was the administration. Big hullabaloo. And it turned out there were no liners. There was no monitoring of radioactive waste. There was no checking of the trucks that brought the waste to see how radioactive it was. It was just out of control. And the public was the Memphis public, EDEC, which is the state agency, was in control and hadn't informed anybody of this. And we wanted local control. We wanted to make sure that the right standards were adopted, and we wanted approval on whether to have this or not. And another question I have, a general question, is why not leave all this radioactive waste, even though it's supposedly low level, at the site where it's produced instead of spreading it out all over the place? And the third question I have is, at the time, they were sending a lot of foreign waste to Memphis and all kinds of other local places. So if you all could respond, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, NRC staff, are we prepared to address any of Stephen's comments or questions?
Well, thanks for your comments, Stephen. This is Dave Esham. At a high level, I would say that, absolutely, regulatory control and oversight is necessary in the management of radioactive materials and radioactive waste. And the number one, you rely on the people that generate it and the people that operate facilities where the material goes to try to do the right thing or do the right thing, and for the most part they do. But the regulator has a role in that process to ensure that in the circumstances where mainly inadvertently things don't go right, that they get corrected and they go right. So from a high level, that's my response. It's a good comment, and we appreciate it.
Okay, and I do just want to I do want to follow up just quickly, and I see Cordelia has her hand raised. So I do want to just, George, if you could confirm what we're going to do about some of the questions in the chat that we're not getting to, that we don't have time to get to, because we've got still 4 more presentations, I think, to go through. Is there some way that you're going to respond to those questions and post them somewhere or provide them to attendees?
So what I plan to do is I'm going to go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I plan to try to provide as much detail as possible in the meeting summary. I think that's the best place to put this kind of discussion and what's in the chat. Whether we respond to each individual question, I guess I'll have to think about that one a little harder. I don't want to commit to something that we can't. We can't do, but we'll take that one back, and I'll ask some others whether we should be doing that or not. But I'm going to do my best on the meeting summary.
Okay, great. And it let's see, Cordelia, if you want to just or yeah, George, are you ready for us to move on?
Yeah, I'm going to make this real quick.
Okay.
Tennessee is an agreement state, so they have the authority to regulate low-level waste disposal. There used to be a requirement that at the landfills, I don't know, back in the day, I've been around a long time, so approaching almost 40 years doing this. But back in the day, there used to be a requirement at landfills that there would be some type of monitors for radioactive material to make sure it didn't get into landfills. And the last thing, why isn't it disposed of where it's generated? Additionally, back in the day, we used to have a regulation in Part 20 that would just allow random disposal of waste. And we found that did not meet with public health and safety, and found waste at sites that were not suitable. And so that's why we withdrew that requirement out of Part 20 in the early 60s. When the state of Florida said our water table is too high to adopt a regulation like that, allowing the random disposal of waste. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Cordelia. All right, George, who do we have next? All right.
Yeah, next is Amy Robinson from DOE.
Okay. All right, and Ms. Robinson, I don't believe I have slides for you. Is that correct?
Right, there's no slides.
That is correct.
All right.
I am Amy Robinson, the Acting Office Director for the Office of Waste Disposal and Environmental Management at the United States Department of Energy. Our shorthand name is DOE. DOE thanks the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the opportunity to participate today. DOE offers these informal comments and will supplement further written formal comments by any applicable deadlines. George has already discussed that this is an informal discussion today. DOE wanted to take a moment to reintroduce ourselves and our relationship to this proceeding. DOE's Environmental Management Office mission is cleanup. We clean up several sites all over the country. We are governed by many authorities, including a manual, which I'd like to restate a couple of sentences from. DOE's Radioactive Waste Management Manual, which is 435.1, has a tiered policy, TIERED, on treatment, storage, and disposal, which states DOE waste shall be treated, stored, and in the case of low-level waste, disposed of at the site where the waste is generated, if practical, or at another DOE facility. If DOE's capabilities are not practical or cost-effective, exemptions may be approved to allow use of a non-DOE facility for the storage, treatment, or disposal of DOE waste. The goal of waste disposal is to be fully protective of the worker and public health and the environment in compliance with applicable federal, state, and local requirements with all necessary permits, licenses, and approvals for the specific waste. Currently, there is sufficient low-level and mixed waste low-level disposal capacity at DOE and commercial facilities to support the EM cleanup mission. So therefore, today, DOE has a vested interest and continues to support and appreciates NRC's effort to clarify and maintain consistency with the original basis for 10 CFR Part 61. DOE also supports NRC's effort to update regulatory requirements for disposal of GTCC and low-level waste. We are providing a few comments for your consideration and some of our suggested clarification based on DOE's experience. In previous public forums, and again today, DOE offers the following items. Generally, DOE agrees with NRC that near-surface disposal is a suitable option for greater than Class C disposal when the waste acceptance criteria are developed based on site-specific performance analysis that considers the actual site conditions and the characteristics of the waste to be disposed. For example, DOE suggests that NRC provide an opportunity for site-specific analysis regarding disposal, which I think we've already discussed today. For example, 5 meters below the top surface of a cover would be an example. Another suggestion is that NRC provide analyses for sites based on their climate or demographics, such as the more arid sites, which are typical of radioactive disposal locations. DOE suggests that NRC provide improved perspective on intrusion scenarios considered as a basis for Part 61. For example, the use of mud pits, and include DOE intrusion scenarios, which I think has already been discussed today. Another suggestion is that NRC include accompanying guidance for sites on individual waste stream analysis and inventory tracking to add regulatory flexibility based on site-specific information. To reiterate, DOE agrees with the NRC that near-surface disposal is a suitable option for greater than Class C disposal when the waste acceptance criteria are fully developed based on a site-specific performance analysis that considers the actual individual site conditions and characteristics of the waste to be disposed. Again, we will be supplementing our comments in future consideration, and thank you for your time and consideration today. Again, my name is Amy Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. NRC staff, any clarifying questions or on what Ms. Robinson presented?
This is Dave. This is Dave. One thing I would add is that just so the public know that our criteria do not apply to DOE disposal facilities. DOE's criteria applies to their facilities. Our criteria would apply to commercial low-level waste disposal facilities.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. George, did you want to move on to Urenco, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, let's move on to Wyatt Paget from Urenco.
Okay, excellent. All right, Wyatt, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with your slides. One moment. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss today. Urenco has long been engaged on this rulemaking and the potential impact it has not only to us, but also to the utilities and to the industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are with disposal, as well as the rulemaking effort and regulatory analysis. But as we've had some discussion on the regulatory analysis, I'll try to be brief, so there's enough time for other presentations. Go to the next slide. So Urenco has the only large-scale operating uranium enrichment facility in North America. While the facility supplies a large portion of the U.S. enrichment market needs, we're unable to do it alone. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that much of the U.S. enrichment needs are supplied from our sister facilities in Europe. Urenco as a whole has a total capacity of 18 million SWU, that's separative work units. It's across our fleets and supplies utilities around the world. The remaining accessible U.S. enrichment industry needs are supplied from the French Orano facility as well as the Russian enrichment capacity. Go to the next slide. We also provide other services to the industry that includes managing of nuclear materials, development of medical isotopes, and decommissioning services. We have our own deconversion facility at our United Kingdom site where uranium hexafluoride is deconverted to an oxide prior to disposal. On the next slide, there's a picture of the facility. Deconversion is an important part of the fuel cycle and the first step towards disposal of depleted UF6. Our UK tails management facility is part of our commitment to environmental, social, and governance commitments. It's been online since 2019. We have plans to expand it, its operational capabilities. Let's see, I'm going to skip that, go to the next slide. So the Department of Energy has exercised its authorities under the Atomic Energy Act and Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Amendment Act to confirm a disposal pathway for deconverted Urenco USA tails in a federal cell at a U.S. disposal site. If it's treated as waste, depleted uranium falls under Class A level, low-level waste. It's suitable for near-surface disposal. Disposal would occur at a U.S. federal disposal cell. Urenco USA is currently moving forward with a pilot project to dispose of a limited quantity of tails in order to ensure that the entire deconversion and disposal pathway operates effectively. We have an export license and a contract in place for the return of the material and disposal at one of the U.S. disposal sites, which is expected to be completed early this year. We are also investigating deconversion with the potential to invest in a deconversion facility at the U.S. site in New Mexico. While it's not currently funded, we have allocated space for a domestic facility. Next slide. So at the end of 2023, we had approximately 4,500 cylinders. This is tails material, uranium hexafluoride, stored on our site storage pad. We perform surveillances on these cylinders. We don't possess any 48Xs or thin-walled 48Gs at our site. Cylinders are in good condition, and due to the arid environment, they've seen little signs of aging. We have a site license limit to store no more than 25,000 cylinders at the site. And based upon our current annual projections for the next 20 years, as far as our generation, we don't expect to exceed the site license limit. As a result of our, one of the things that we're doing as part of our responsible nuclear stewardship, and something that I discussed previously just a few seconds ago, is trying to dispose of tails material in advance. And so we are actively pursuing that, even though we've got plenty of capacity for the rest of the license term, which is near 20 years. Go to the next slide. So Urenco USA is committed to endorsing and actively supporting well-researched and thought-out regulation that contributes to the overall welfare of our industry, fosters fair competition, and ensures the highest standards of ethical business practices. A clear understanding of disposal criteria is crucial to the continued safe operation within the industry and sustainable business models, which ensures energy independence for the United States. Urenco USA has provided comments on this rulemaking in the past, and I'm providing a session numbers from those previous submittals for ease of access. And on the next slide. So we discussed earlier a previous NRC review of the impact to the safety need and impact to the industry that was documented in a draft regulatory analysis for the final rule that was proposed in 2017. During that analysis, assumptions were made on the direct impact to 4 licensees and agreement states. There was no analysis that was conducted on the pass-through costs. As the pass-through costs were not included, Urenco USA's perspective has been, and still is, that the cost estimate falls significantly short of the total impact to the industry. And input from Urenco and industry members is needed for the regulatory analysis to be properly completed. Urenco's estimates were more than 10 times the NRC's analysis alone. So, we discussed earlier that the NRC never publicly addressed these comments from the 2017 Federal Register inquiry. Those questions from the Commission are central to the views that Urenco USA has expressed on multiple occasions. And for efficient rulemaking, it sounds like you're addressing those comments in the analysis you're performing now. But we still would like the NRC to provide feedback on a matter that the Commission clearly directed you to address. In closing, this rulemaking, it's been lengthy. Years of comments have been provided by Urenco USA, as well as others and as part of the industry and members of the public. What we believe is happening is the NRC is not simply restarting the effort, and the NRC is reviewing those past comments. And it does appear so. If for some reason that's not the case, we recommend doing so, as we believe it has significant benefit, as a lot of effort has been expended on these rulemaking efforts. In the last slide. So lastly, I'd just like to thank the NRC for conducting this meeting, the opportunity to speak, and if you have questions for me today or in the future, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, thank you very much, Wyatt. NRC staff, are there any clarifying questions based on Wyatt's presentation? And hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the public. So please raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, *5. I am going to try to maybe sort through some of the chat questions. I know we got a lot of chat questions. I apologize. They're a little bit overwhelming for me to keep up with. So it is helpful if folks do raise their hand. So we'll do about maybe 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. So if you, let's see, raise hand. And I see, Dave, you've been answering a couple questions in the chat. Some of those questions earlier from, I believe it was Tim. Dave, I don't know if you want to review a couple of those quickly, just run through what you've responded to today so far in the chat.
I've just tried to be as responsive as I can, listening to the presenters and the chat that's scrolling up rapidly. So yeah, just some information for ones that I could easily try to answer now, that you could feel like we tried to answer your questions and didn't blow you off. That's all.
Okay. Let's see, is it worth me reading those aloud? Let's see. Got a lot of questions here. I will read the one that you just responded to. Question number 6. WCS and TCEQ representatives have claimed that there is no difference in class or greater than class C criteria. Is that accurate? And if so, why isn't GTCC just classified as class C waste? The proposed criteria are not yet issued. However, what TCEQ said is mostly accurate. The fundamental technical analyses would be the same. GTCC waste would be required to have a 500-year intruder barrier and be buried 5 meters deep, where Class C waste is required to have a 500-year intruder barrier or be buried 5 meters deep. There are other technical considerations for certain types of GTCC, such as heat generation and radiolysis, but those would not apply to all types of GTCC. Let's see. I'm just going to read this comment from Pat. Depleted uranium from the Portsmouth nuclear site is transuranics because high-level radioactive waste was run through the gaseous diffusion and enrichment process for decades. There's a lot of technetium-99 in the cylinders as well. This is highly dangerous. Okay, so if there are no raised hand questions, I will give everybody a chance to just hit that raise hand if anyone wants to speak up. If you're on your phone, it's *5 on your phone if you want to raise your hand and you're on a cell phone calling in. And I'm looking to see, all right, Connie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Connie.
Thank you.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. One thing that's in general disturbing to me, and I will kind of address this to Urenco because it was raised. But in general, and some of the other presentations hinted at this. The mandate of the NRC, unlike the DOE, is not to promote nuclear power or to enable nuclear power providers or the whole gamut of, for example, producers of uranium fuel. That's why the Atomic Energy Commission was split up in 1974. The DOE, what became the DOE's mission, is promoting nuclear power. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the NRC's mission is to regulate nuclear power and to protect public health and safety. So I don't like this trend, and I've been doing this since 1972, and I don't like this trend of the NRC talking in terms of the burdens of the industry, the impact, the negative impact on the industry. Truly, those kinds of costs should be outside the realm of the NRC. Okay, thank you for letting me vent.
Yep. Okay, and I'm not seeing any other raised hands. So George, would you suggest we move on to the next presentation?
Yeah, well, I do see Cordelia has her hand up, so let's give her maybe 30 seconds to answer, and then we'll move on.
I just wanted to add some clarifying information. There is a difference between Class C and greater than Class C waste, and that's outlined in 61.55, paragraph 4, that talks about waste that's not generally acceptable for near-surface disposal and is reserved to the NRC at the moment, and it's also carved out in the Low-Level Waste Policy Amendments Act of 1985. There is a difference between an and an or. GTCC requirements are or, but greater than Class C is an and. There are definitely some additional considerations, and I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Okay, thanks, Cordelia. So, Sarah, we're going to move on to Thomas Majette from Severn Nuclear Services. If you could bring up Thomas's presentation. And then, yep. Thomas, once you see that presentation come up on screen, you can unmute yourself and start your presentation.
All right, just one moment. I'm getting there. You'd think I'd be an expert at this by now, but...
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, George. I appreciate the opportunity to make a few comments this afternoon. I'm commenting on behalf of Energy Solutions, who operates 2 of the 4 low-level radioactive waste disposal sites in the U.S. And you can go to the next slide, please. I have 4 comments I'd like to make. The first is on schedule. With all due respect, David, I don't see the integrated rulemaking and the addition of GTCC waste and depleted uranium as being a significant enough change to restart the clock. We've been doing this since 2008, and I encourage staff to stick with the current schedule that it has. We've seen a lot of slippages along the way, and I'd certainly like to see it press on. My next comment is that I think we need a thorough review. I don't want this to be in conflict with the first comment, and I know the staff has said they don't favor publishing any rulemaking language, preliminary rulemaking language, as has been done in the past. And David, you just said a while ago that we are able to make comments on a proposed rule, and they will be considered in the issuance of the final rule, and I accept that. But I still submit that things happen, and you need an independent review to minimize unintended consequences. I have 2 examples. Part 37 as promulgated, not just as proposed, basically made retired steam generators that were parked outside the protected area in violation of that rule. And NRC recognized that somebody couldn't just sneak in the dark of night and walk away with a several 100-ton generator. And so they issued enforcement discretion, but that actually got promulgated, and it shouldn't have. In this particular rule itself is another good example in terms of the grandfathering of the sites that have no intention of taking depleted uranium or large quantities of high activity waste. And so I think that was a mistake to take that language out. And if you're not going to publish it for review, I would suggest that you still get an enhanced independent review. I would suggest all 4 of the cited states should be included, not just one. Compact representatives in the ACRS, I think, would help provide an independent review. So I think that's something that you should consider. Next slide, please. My third comment is about the timeframes. This is something that we've discussed many times over the years. I firmly believe that 1,000 years should be a time limit for a compliance period or a hard and fast requirement for something like ensuring stability. Longer timeframes are more appropriately addressed qualitatively, basically along the terms of the performance period. Staff itself pointed out in your presentation to the ACRS that there are uncertainties that will increase over time, and regulatory approval to allow disposal should evaluate the impacts, recognizing the uncertainty, not stop the analysis. And I accept that. I'm not suggesting that the analysis should be stopped, but it should be addressed in a different manner. I'm not saying stick your head in the sand or that you have to go geologic because of uncertainty, but I will say, next slide, please, that the way to treat uncertainty, next slide, please, is
Did I
that,
get there for you? Sorry
yes,
about that.
thank you. It's not best addressed by continuing to model out into deep time because there are model uncertainties. Yes, you may get results that are useful in decision making, and so therefore you should consider or continue the analysis. But there are other factors that I think are more important than necessarily attempting to model out to extremely long periods of time. And David, you mentioned the improvements in engineering. I certainly agree with that, and the increase in computing power that we have. But what we know from siting studies, a lot of it is unchanged over the years, but it's still very valuable. Things like remoteness and taking advantage of natural geological features of the disposal site are very powerful protectors of human health and safety. Engineered features also come into play in the siting equation, not just in improvements in modeling. Things like depth of disposal, which is a part of this rulemaking. Also, the waste forms, including the protection that comes into play from 6155 in terms of limiting concentrations of activity and packaging. So there's a lot that goes into this. No single layer offers the protection that is necessary in safely siting a disposal site. And I don't think you make up for that with long-term modeling. Next slide, please. My final comment is about the applicability of the rule. I don't think you need new terminology. I don't like the term exception. 61.6 talks about exemptions. It's a different thing, but I think exceptions will be inferred to suggest that something is not being addressed that maybe should be. I don't think you need that term. It's not helpful nor necessary. You can modify 61.1b as you have suggested. I mean, all of these sub-bullets on this slide are from NRC staff presentations. I think you could put them in there and just refer to criteria. But the use of the term exceptions is confusing and it's not necessary, and it suggests that something is being omitted that maybe shouldn't be omitted. So that's the end of my comments. I appreciate your time. I look forward to making them more formally in the future, those of which you hadn't, of course, yet already addressed. And I'd be happy if you have any questions that you want me to answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. We appreciate that presentation. NRC staff, do you have any clarifying questions on Mr. Majet's presentation? Okay, and hearing none, I am going to ask that since we still have, let's see, I believe one more presentation to go, and I'm just going to check that quickly. And that would be from Diane Dorigo. We can stop and pause for a moment and take some additional questions. So please, if you're on the Teams meeting and you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And I will call on you here. And I see that Larry Camper has raised his hand. Larry, go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
I have done that. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Very good. Thank you so much. And thanks to the NRC staff for the presentation today. Very complicated rulemaking, long time in the making, and I was there in the beginning, so I understand how complicated it's been. But I do have two questions, probably for Dave Esch. And this is a specific question. Dave, does the staff at this point in time have an impression as to whether or not the tables in 61.55 would need to be changed, given that the cutoff for true waste today is 100 nanocuries per gram, and we know that a significant amount, greater than 70%, of the GTCC true waste stream with oversight by DOE contains more than 100 nanocuries per gram. So we have this 100 nanocuries per gram sitting there. Does the staff envision a need to change the tables to address that? And if not, how will you address that? And then the other question while I've got you is, back in SECI 150094, produced in 2015, there was attachments to that SECI in which the staff addressed a number of things, including the potential for addressing security issues that might be associated with the disposal of true waste at a near surface disposal. So how will the staff be addressing that issue that was raised way back in that SECI in 2015? Thank you.
So this is Dave. Larry, for your first one, I'll answer that, and then maybe if Tim McCartan is on and listened to your second question, he might be the right person to answer that one. Regarding the first one, the waste classification tables. So the waste classification tables were a construct that was put in place to implement 10 CFR Part 61, given at that time that they felt that there were going to be a large number of disposal facilities implemented in the U.S. And the regulator wanted some consistency with how waste was classified, because waste is transported between states, and at that time different compacts. There was all this complexity about ensuring the consistency of information, treatment, et cetera, for material that was deemed radioactive waste. Now, moving forward, there's only a small handful of facilities, and the facilities are in significantly different environments with different engineering. And so that initial assumption about the number of facilities and how that problem should be solved, quite frankly, was not correct. And so this approach of using the site-specific technical analyses alleviates the burden, if somebody wants to, of waste acceptance at their particular facility. And so if the tables have a concentration limit for, and I would clarify, it's for transuranic radionuclides in Part 61 of 100 nanocuries per gram. If they have a concentration limit of 100 nanocuries per gram for Class C waste, that doesn't mean that the tables need to be revised in order for somebody to deal with waste that has more than 100 nanocuries per gram. And that's where the site-specific technical analysis would come in. Now, there could be some benefit to revising the waste classification system because it's so rigid and one-dimensional, for a problem that has more dimensions than that. And because the list of radionuclides included in the table is relatively small based on the wastes that were analyzed in the early 1980s. And as things have changed, you have potential for fusion waste, advanced reactors, et cetera. The isotopes that may be generated, their quantities, the particular isotopes, and their concentrations may differ. So that would point towards expanding the tables and adding more radionuclides to the tables. And potentially making the tables, maybe you would have a table for wet sites and a table for dry sites, for instance, something simple like that. Or a table for wet, shallow, wet, deep, dry, shallow, dry, deep. I'm just talking out loud. But, that task of revising the waste classification system is a very complicated task. And it's not necessary at the moment if you implement what would be hopefully reaching the proposed stage here. So maybe, Tim, if you're on, if you want to talk to the other one or somebody else.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. This is Tim McCartan, NRC staff. And just briefly, Larry, you're correct that some of the GTCC waste, because of the concentrations of certain materials, are of concern from a physical protection standpoint. In the proposed rule, we have looked at an approach for where we would allow the agreement states authority for some of that. And there's a fair amount of discussion there of what we've considered in the different types of waste and what would make it where it would need special physical protection requirements or less physical protection requirements, depend on the type and concentrations of the waste. And I guess I would encourage you and everyone look at when the proposed rule comes out, we have a fair amount of discussion on that topic that gives our basis, and we very much are interested, as been pointed out, hearing people's comments on that discussion.
This is Cordelia. I had my hand up, then I lowered it. And as you know, Larry, there are some limitations in terms of special nuclear material that agreement states can regulate, and it's tied down to Section 274 of the Atomic Energy Act and also incorporated in Part 150. So we definitely did a deep dive in looking at that issue, the security issues, as a part of the proposed rule, as Tim has talked about. But I also just wanted to mention the statutory angle on that.
Okay, thank you, Cordelia, and Tim and Dave. Larry, your hand is still raised. Are you set with that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have taken it down. No, I appreciate the explanations. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, George, do we feel ready to move on to Diane?
Yeah, let's go to Diane Dorigo.
Okay. All right, Diane, all you. If you're there, Diane, you just have to unmute yourself. Hit your microphone icon.
Got it. Okay.
Got it. All right, we hear you. Great.
Okay. This is Diane Dorigo. I'm the Radioactive Waste Project Director at Nuclear Information and Resource Service. My background's in chemistry and environmental studies and advocacy. I have worked at universities, chemical corporations, and public interest groups. And I am speaking today, having tracked this rule since its inception, having actually not commented on the one that was adopted in December of 1982, but was part of an organization at the time, the Sierra Club Radioactive Waste Campaign, which did do comments on that. So been tracking this since it started. For how much longer will humans pretend that burying long-lasting, intensely concentrated man-made radioactive material in trenches 30 to 100 feet deep provides adequate isolation from the environment and living things. Burial grounds leak. In the 40+ years that I've been tracking the definitions, management, storage, and so-called disposal of radioactive waste, there have been improvements, but there is a constant pressure to weaken the already inadequate public protection and environmental protection. It's good that commercial nuclear waste can't be buried in cardboard boxes anymore, and that liquids above a certain amount are prohibited, and that avoiding 100-year floodplains is required, although those flood frequencies are increasing, and the NRC regulations regularly ignore the realities of climate change. Since 1982, there have been concentration limits on some of the radionuclides, although every radionuclide, no matter how long it lasts, may be buried in these so-called low-level radioactive waste facilities. Now the proposal is to allow much higher concentrations, which will be dangerous much longer, in fact, hundreds of thousands of years. Some of us argued back in '85 when the states were being forced to take legal liability and responsibility for disposing of nuclear waste, commercial nuclear power waste particularly, that long-lasting waste should not go into trenches that cannot isolate it for as long as it's hazardous. That is one of the reasons that it took over 30 years from when the Low-Level Waste Policy Act and its amendments passed until a facility opened for nuclear waste, a 10 CFR 61 agreement state licensed facility. People do not want cancer-causing, immune-compromising radioactive materials leaking into their water, soil, air, even if it is supposedly at a legal level of exposure. And the latest version of this proposed rule increases the allowable exposures from so-called low-level radioactive waste sites. Wanted to take some from comments that we submitted with 100 other organizations back in 2015. The proposed regulations then, and it appears now, allow more than 33 times higher radioactive releases and exposures from so-called low-level waste sites than from the high-level waste facility formerly proposed at Yucca Mountain. Federal regulations for the high-level repository allow a release of radioactivity of 15 millirems per year for the first 10,000 years. This proposal here is for 25 millirems during operation, but up to and beyond 500 millirems per year from the so-called radioactive waste disposal sites. 500 millirems is a risk of 1 in 25 adults exposed getting cancer. That's a 500 millirems, 1 in 25 will get cancer, according to the EPA's rules and the National Academy of Sciences risk assessments. Then that's assuming a lifetime dose. As 10 CFR 61 is on deck to be updated, it is clear the NRC is doing all it can to allow waste that exceeds the concentration limits that are already too high to go into these facilities. Various ways are on the table to circumvent or do away with the limits. A differing NRC opinion paper by Cordelia Maupin, who's been...
Oop, Diane, you just muted yourself. Or somehow you got muted. Diane, you just have to...
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I was saying that Maupin's differing NRC opinion paper outlines the legal, technical, security, and policy violations of permitting greater than C and depleted uranium into the 10 CFR 61 facilities. This waste should go to federally licensed high-level waste radioactive facilities. The adoption of 10 CFR 61 established rules and regulations. Over time, these have been varied and there have been exemptions, and computer codes that claim to be able to predict the doses to members of the public in years, decades, and centuries to come are being used. Nuclear waste generators, government regulators, and less often members of the public pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to gain access to and learn to use these computer codes. At the beginning, the concern was raised about the lack of transparency on what's being done here. The codes are one of the black box secret ways. The probabilistic performance assessments are black boxes that are being used or being proposed to be used to justify longer lasting and more intensely radioactive waste going to sites that are not really capable of isolating the waste for as long as it's dangerous. Over the various iterations of this rulemaking, there have been efforts to deregulate nuclear waste, calling it below regulatory concern. There was a very low level waste proposal that came and went in the last couple of years. Clearance, exemption, other terminology. Although I didn't see it in the... Did I mute again? Although I don't see the below regulatory concern provision or very low level waste in this, I want to make clear that it will not be accepted by the public. We're opposing the deregulation of waste. We're opposing the movement of higher concentration and longer lasting waste into these facilities. And the technical concerns on this have been repeatedly presented to the NRC by the state of Utah, by Heal Utah, by the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, and others. The regulations in subpart C, sections 61.41 to 44, protection of the general public from releases of radioactivity, in this proposal expressly allow doses of 500 millirems effective dose equivalent per year to members of the public. Although the existing concentration tables that distinguish the classes A, B, C, and greater than C are based on allowing 500 millirems per year, this is unacceptable. The current limit is 25 millirems per year, and the risk at that level is 1 in 500 people getting cancer, so exposed. Men getting cancer. For females, children, and babies, it's a much higher risk, 7 times more for baby girls at the same level as compared to a standard man. At the 500 millirems, as I've said, 1 in 25 people exposed over their lifetime will get cancer. This makes the existing rule unacceptable, but the new rule would be worse, even worse, as it would allow higher concentrations. As I said, 33 times higher than would be allowed at the rules for the high-level waste facility. It's the 500 is 20 times higher than releases allowed from operating nuclear power reactors. And it is by the EPA and its 40 CFR 190 limits. And this amount of exposures from a facility that would be closed for decades, centuries, or millennia. It's not even an operating facility. So we oppose the proposed rule changes that would do this. We're concerned about the creation of compliance and performance and protective assurance periods that cannot be guaranteed. Changing 100 years of institutional control to other longer periods doesn't do anything to isolate the waste during that time. It's just something plugged into computer models that have never been fully verified or validated. In other words, the computer models are allowing greater than Class C depleted uranium and other long-lasting and intense materials into the 10 CFR 61 sites, but we'll never know. We're not going to be around in 500 years to see whether those levels are exceeded. And if you look at the history of existing sites, the ones that started, the first 6 of them, all have leaked. Some are continuing to leak. I have more to say, but I realize that we are coming up against, let's see, I did want to say one more thing about the technical concerns. Dr. Arjun Makajani and Bryce Smith of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research provided numerous technical challenges to the allowance of greater than C NDU depleted uranium into these facilities, specifically into the Waste Control Specialist Facility. We call on the staff to re-review those papers and Maupin's differing opinion and the 2015 comments from my organization, Nuclear Information Resource Service, and 100 other organizations. The uranium health risks are higher than assumed. This is a major federal action and requires an environmental impact statement. It looks like the schedule, and there's been pressure to keep on the schedule this time. I think that 90 days for public comments needs to be extended, and that I also raise concern about the shift, the Department of Energy saying that the NRC agrees that greater than C can go to burial sites. This has not been the main opinion of the NRC, and the shift should not be considered to be one of the entire agency at this point. That's a conclusion for now, but I do, of course, plan to provide comments on the proposal when it comes up.
Thank you, Diane. We appreciate that, you taking the time to be here today with us. I do want to stop and ask for NRC staff. Do you need any clarifications from Diane's information? Okay, Cordelia?
I still stand by my differing professional opinion. I do want to put that on the record. I still stand by everything that was placed in that document. Some of the concerns raised about dual regulation that Dan mentioned are in there. The issue of disruption of the compact system, which took a lot of very high-level people to come to agreement on that Low-Level Waste Policy Amendments Act and the Low-Level Waste Policy Act of 1980 and 1985, respectfully. That has, to me, stood the test of time. It also goes back to the issues that were raised by Larry Camper in terms of security issues. So I still stand by what is in that document, and that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Cordelia. Now, I've been given a couple of times, a little bit of time to run through some of the things in the chat that I can, but I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. And I think George discussed that at the beginning of this meeting because it was a lot to go through in a little bit of time. But I do want to give folks the opportunity to, again, hit the raise hand icon or hit *5 on their phone if you're calling in. If you want to speak a comment right now, ask a question right now aloud. It seems like that's a good way to get heard as well. So go ahead and hit that raise hand icon or *5 on your phone and I can help you out. And while we're waiting for those to come through, I do want to point to the chat. There were several questions put in the chat. Dave Esch has been doing an excellent job trying to keep up with a lot of them. Of some of the questions that Tim initially put in the chat, he answered question number 3, 6, and 7. So I encourage you to read through the chat because I'm not going to have time to read through every single one of these chat responses. But let's see, for instance, I'm sorry, this is hard for me to go through. Karen, I see you have your hand raised. You can go ahead. Karen Haddon, go ahead and unmute yourself. And
Hi, I just am requesting that the chat be recorded and made available. However you can best do that.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask George that. George, will the chat be made part of, be appended to the meeting summary or anything along those lines?
So I think what I said a little while ago is I'm going to do my best in the meeting summary to provide a summary of the chat, and where we answered a question, we'll add that to the meeting summary. I'm not sure that we're going to answer all of the questions in the meeting summary, but if it's in the existing chat, then I'm going to do my best to summarize those in the meeting summary. So you can look forward to that next month.
So the ones that you don't have answers to, we won't see then.
I'm not sure. We're going to take that one back and see if we can answer them, or I'm not sure what I could commit to at this point.
Okay. So there was a question. I'm going to start to work backward a little bit. There was a question about the United Kingdom using a strict dose constraint. This is a comment about using a strict dose constraint for compliance period of several hundred years, and the UK continues calculations beyond that for risk guidance levels. They do this instead of using strict dose limits. And Dave Esch responded in the chat, UK regulators were present when the NRC presented this information at DispoNet, which was in October of 2023. They stated that they rely on long-term technical analyses to make licensing decisions. So for instance, the low-level radioactive waste site DRIG is expected to be fully eroded in 2,000 to 5,000 years. And the UK regulator stated that they would expect the analyses to be longer if this were not to occur. And then another person, Roger Seitz, commented that I was just stating the regulatory position in the UK. Your response is consistent with UK regulation. The longer term calculations are quantitative in the UK, but are compared to a risk guidance level and are not interpreted as strict compliance with a dose constraint. Let's see, we have there's a couple of comments in the chat. This is related to I think an earlier comment about consideration of burden on industry. So Perry Robinson commented, consideration of burden on the industry is explicitly required pursuant to presidential executive orders. And I believe that's referring to some of our requirements that we have to do for rulemaking, where we have to look at kind of costs of rulemaking, et cetera, costs and benefits of rulemaking. And we do have a comment from unknown user that says, the comments in the chat are part of the public record and equate with official comments. The NRC should record the comments and questions and make them available to the public. Let's see, related to the comment that I read earlier about depleted uranium from the Portsmouth nuclear site, Dave Esch responded that it would be expected that all significant radioactivity present in a waste stream would be evaluated. So if the depleted uranium isn't pure, that would be included in the technical analysis. And let's see what else here. I read Dave's question answer to question 6. Dave had a response to Tim's question 7, which was, have any sites aside from the WCS facility in Texas expressed interest in GTCC disposal? How many commercial low-level radioactive waste sites currently operate in agreement states? How many of those are licensed for disposal of Class A, B, and C waste? And Dave says, no sites besides have Texas, or states, I'm guessing he meant to say, no states besides Texas have expressed interest in GTCC waste disposal. There are currently 4 operating sites. 3 of the 4 are licensed for A, B, and C. So that is one response. And I see a lot of hands raised, so we'll just go to those quickly.
I don't think Karen got unmuted.
Oh, okay. I will fix some. I'll fix some muting. Cordelia, did you want to jump in while I fix some muting?
Yeah, I would just clarify that Texas, in and of itself, has not expressed, as a state, has not expressed the desire to take on greater than Class C waste. No letter from the governor. It will have to come from the governor. The governor has not submitted to us a request for GTCC waste. It would have to come from the governor. We have at the division level, or there were some questions raised that we responded back to and have been responding to as a part of the greater than Class C effort. But I think we should be clear, because we've had some letters in from the governor of the state no letter from the governor has explicitly stated that they want the authority.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Cordelia. All right, I'm going to go to a couple other raised hands, and then I'm probably going to send it back to George to close us out. So Derek Woodmeyer, I see you have your hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, huh? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm responding to. I'm trying to help you guys out. I'm going to tell George. We've got a lot of experience running these meetings with ACRS. Don't leave the meeting until you figure out what you want to do with this stuff in the chat. Otherwise, it'll be gone. I don't know what you're going to do to record all of that, but people have been asking you to do that. If you leave the meeting, it's going to be gone. So.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. George.
I heard that.
Yep. Okay. And Pat, I see Pat Marida. If I'm saying that correctly, Pat, you may go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Well, I was just going to reinforce that business about that chat could easily be saved. And in fact, I think you could probably, most people that are participating now can select it all and copy it and save it. It seems to do all, though some of the responses are truncated. I do have concerns because we continue to generate this waste when there really isn't a good solution for it. And there isn't any solution for it. It lasts a lot longer than because one single, a specific radioactive particle will disintegrate, but it forms isotopes of other radioactive elements, and those all have their own decay period, half-lives, and then they also give out neutrons and alpha particles that hit other normal, shall we say, regular elements and make them radioactive. So they continue to generate new radioactivity so that it's like the gift that keeps on giving. Everything that radioactivity touches becomes radioactive. So we're not dealing with small items here. We're creating compounds and dangerous materials that threaten life on Earth, and we cannot be too careful with them. In fact, we cannot really be generating any more of them. So I will end my comment there.
Okay. Thank you, Pat. All right, and Larry, if you wanted to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and do so. Larry Camper.
I have done that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is kind of a rulemaking mechanics question. And Cordelia is what brought this to my mind. In the regulatory basis document for GTCC, there was a great deal of discussion about the relationship with Part 150 and some of the implications of what addressing GTCC would mean in terms of Part 150. So will the Part 150 issues addressed in the regulatory basis document be dealt with primarily through statements of consideration language, or does the staff envision the need to make actual changes to Part 150? Thank you.
Okay.
Tim McCartan, you want to take that one real quick?
Sure. Yeah. There are some limited changes that we're making to parts 150 and 73. Obviously, as we continue on this, it's not a proposed rule on the street yet. There might be other changes, but yes, there are some limited changes that are being contemplated at this time. If that's helpful.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Okay. Let me go back to the chat quickly. And I know, George, you have a couple follow-up slides that I'm going to pull up for you here.
Okay, I need to go.
And I'll mute Larry so we don't have to hear him exiting. Okay. And let me get us to the slide where we left off. There we go. Okay.
Okay, great. So now we're on to next steps for this rulemaking. So this slide here provides a pictorial view of the rulemaking process, and you can see where we are now. We've been developing the proposed rule for the past year or so now, and we held a public meeting in May of 2023, as you heard Jane mention in her opening remarks, and that's in addition to today's meeting. So we've had 2 public meetings to discuss the proposed rule. We've been presenting on this topic to a number of different audiences, such as agreement state regulator workshops and whatnot over the past year or more. We do plan to submit the proposed rule and with its guidance to the Commission by May of 2024. You heard some statements about that earlier in the meeting. And then if the Commission approves, then we'll publish the proposed rule in the Federal Register. And that notice will then include instructions on how to provide your public comments. So that is the most important part of the process for members of the public to be able to have their say in this rulemaking, is to provide those public comments at that time. So if you could move to slide 22, please. In the meantime, you can go to regulations.gov and search the docket ID, as you see here on the screen, where you can find all the docketed information on this rulemaking. Let's go to slide 23. And then here are the contacts for this rulemaking. You've seen this same slide in previous presentations on this. You see me and the technical leads here for the contacts. Slide 24 is just a set of abbreviations, acronyms, and initialisms for our presentation. Slide 25. We're always interested in hearing how we did and how the meeting went. So please go back to the meeting notice page. You'll find a link on there for providing feedback to us. And that's all of the presentations that I have. And we're going to end the slides at this point. And I'll ask if Jane or other NRC managers have any closing remarks they'd like to make.
Thanks, George. I think I've got my camera off now. I appreciate everybody's time and the discussion today. It helps us understand perspectives of the public and the industry when we have these meetings. So I do want to thank everybody for your time and for your active participation. Okay, back to you, George.
Thanks, Jane. That's all we have for today's public meeting. Again, thank you for your participation. And you'll be seeing a summary of this meeting coming up sometime next month. So look out for that. And then, as you saw in one of my final slides, the proposed rule is currently scheduled to go to the Commission in May of 2024 this year. That's about 4 months away. So be looking out for that as well. So with that, thank you, everybody. We're adjourned. Hey, Sarah, if you want to stay on to the end just to make sure that we get everything captured correctly.
Yes, I can do that, George.
So Sarah, you're an organizer, so you can, Ellen says you can grab the chat.
Yeah, Sarah, whoever the organizer of the meeting is can save the chat.
Hi, Derek. Thank you. Let's see.
What's up, Derek?
Yeah, and then good luck from there.
Okay. Well, do you know, let me see. Are you able to walk me through that real quickly, Derek? Do you know that? I've actually never saved the chat. Chat bubbles. I'm gonna find a way and just
Yeah, see, I don't have the same drop downs that you do as
as the organizer. Okay. I can figure it out. Diane, are you online? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi there. I kind of just answered my own question by not saying anything, so I'm willing to stay on and capture the chat.
Are you able to do that?
I'll figure it out. It's not going to be.
I believe the organizer has to capture the chat.
So
I'm looking into that here.
I mean, any other meeting that we have, the chat is always available after the meeting in Teams.
Yes, and just note we do have members of the public still on the line. So
yeah,
I wanted to comment, if I could, that in addition to capturing it by the organizer, you can always go up and down it and do that Command C. And then if you put it into an email for some reason, it tends to show up. But that's been my experience.
Can you put it into a Word document?
Doesn't seem to work.
I'm working
on
it.
Doesn't? Because that's the issue.
It has not worked for me, but an email for some reason it does. And then you can take it from there. I don't know why.
Do you know?
Good luck.
Do you know if you can? Do you know if you can copy the entire meeting chat as one
You
thing?
should be able to, and then Command V if you have to for the paste.
Yeah, because then that'll be the easiest way, or I don't know if that's the right word, but it sounds like that's a way that you can capture the whole thing.
Only thing that's ever worked for me, but good luck. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah,
Thanks,
see if
bye-bye.
Okay.
And frankly, as I suggested before, I wouldn't leave the chat I wouldn't leave the meeting until you feel like you've properly captured the chat.
Yep, I am not doing that.
Right, just stay on the meeting.
Because I just went outside of the meeting and noticed that the chat is not there.
All right,
Yeah, just
one second.
Just don't leave.
No, it didn't
You see,
capture the
Diane?
chat. It's gone. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Okay,
Well, it is, but that's the issue. That's when we have the ACRS meetings, we'll interrupt the meeting at the beginning and tell people stop talking on the chat because whatever you're saying is going to be gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me try one more thing.
Can you do screenshots? You know how you save with
Yeah, it's just I have never tried that either, but you're talking about taking like 3 hours.
A million of screenshots. All right,
I'm still seeing the chat.
Me
Yeah,
too. But only in the meeting, not outside of the meeting. Like when you go to the
right.
And if you try to copy and paste it, it vanishes.
All right. Yep, exactly. Dan Frumpkin is. I'm going to see if Dan can help us. Dan, help.
Good idea. He just finished. He should be around.
All right, so I'll try something too, but I'm not the organizer, so.
headed.
All right, I sent him a message. Okay. And I just Googled it, export chat from a Teams meeting. So
Okay.
I'm going to figure this out.
Yeah. I think it's not that it can't be done. The problem is if you leave.
Okay, well, I will.
Maybe that's even wrong for the organizer. I don't know. If maybe it'll
Right.
stay for you, but
Well, I will stay. I will not hang up.
Yeah.
I will stay here and make sure. I see that we still have some members of the public online who are
yeah,
taking this ride with me. So I hope.
yeah.
I hope that's-
Probably not intentionally.
Oh, well, that maybe, yeah.
We're probably boring them to death.
Yeah.
No, usually they've done their thing and they've walked away without leaving the meeting. Not that I've ever done that, but speaking of which, I will leave now. Hope you guys figure out
Okay,
the-
guys.
Thanks,
This
Derek.
All righty.
This is what I just did. I highlighted, right click, highlighted all of the chat, and then right clicked it and copied it, opened my Word document and pasted it, and it seems to be there.
And
It's
you got
there?
all the chat there?
I went from top to bottom. I can forward it to you.
Yeah.
There you go.
Wow.
Cordelia
Well, I
to the
got some
rescue.
of it. Let me see. I got some of it. I might have to
Uh-oh.
go back, but you
Yeah,
can make
it's not.
highlight it and then copy and paste.
Dan Frumpkin says there is no way to download the chat. It will stick around for 10 days, so you don't have to figure it out immediately. Which that was my impression, although it's interesting when I do look at when I go outside of the meeting. Oh no, here it is. I do see all the chat. Okay. That was my impression, that the chat isn't going to disappear on us, on NRC folks. Now it may disappear on, non-NRC people, right? When they leave the meeting.
Yeah, so I think I'm now remembering that when we did the public meeting in May, to capture all the chat stuff, I had to copy like individual pieces at a time and paste it into a Word document. Like it wouldn't copy the entire thing at once, but Cordelia, it sounds like you were able to do that.
Yeah, no, I went back. It let me copy parts of it.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
would have to do a couple of those cut and
Yeah.
paste.
Yeah, I think I had to do about 20 or 25 or 30 copy and paste until I got it all.
That is so interesting. I mean,
Yeah,
you would
I
think
don't
that
know
teams.
if CSC knows anything, those people.
I'm a truster of Dan. Dan is all things teams.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All
Okay.
right. Well, I'll just start doing it piecemeal. So if you all want to drop off, I'll just stay on here just until I get it copied, and then I'll end the meeting for everybody. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. And then we're still being recorded at this point.
Yeah.
So
Could we end the recording? You could end the recording.
We could,
I
yeah.
think. Okay. Let me I'll just get started kind of.
I'll stop the recording now.
All right. All right, I will send you what I download. Sound good? Or what I copy and paste over, George. Does that work? That'll make up for some of my facilitating shortcomings today.
We'll get it one way or another.
Okay. Yep,
And
I'll
then-
do it. I'm doing it right now.
I have to go and find where it saves the recording and transcription. I forget exactly where that is, but I got to go back and find that.
Okay.
All right then, guys. Y'all have
All
a
right.
terrific Tuesday.
Thank you,
Cordelia.
Cordelia.
Wonderful Wednesday.
You too.
Okay,
Right.
bye-bye.
All right, bye, Cordelia.
Bye-bye.
So yeah, Sarah, let's go ahead and just stop the meeting at this point.
Okay. I'm gonna
And-
okay.
and
All right.
you're gonna
So I'm
go
gonna
ahead
end the meeting and then it'll stay there. Okay. I'm gonna do that.
I sure hope
Okay.
so.
Yeah, I think so too. I guess we'll
Okay.
find out. Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Yep. Bye.